Hello everyone, welcome to Criminal Justice Research Methods. In this lecture we're going to talk about the logic of criminal justice research. We'll start with a basic introduction of how we approach researching questions and claims in a scientific manner. We'll then move on to an overview of the basic fundamentals of the logic of criminal justice research, followed by a look at some of the strategic approaches to conducting criminal justice research. The appropriate readings for this particular lecture are chapters 1 and 2 of your course textbook. So let's go ahead and get started. Whenever we start with research, we have to think about, well, what questions do you want answered? Do you want to know why crime rates are higher in one city as opposed to another city or a different part of town? Do you want to know what are the impacts of a certain drug or substance on a person? Whatever the questions you have to think about, well, how do I go out and research it? And when doing that, we think about how do we want to answer them? Do I want to go out and survey people and ask them questions and ask for them to respond back with their opinions or thoughts about something? Do I want to set up an experiment where I have a control group and I have an experimental group? Do I want to simply observe the world around me? All of these are the backbone of what makes up research methods or research design. And how you choose to approach a question is going to either give you certain benefits or certain shortcomings. As many of you could probably guess, if I ask people on a survey a bunch of questions, we know that they can lie, right? And that doesn't mean that we're necessarily going to get the most accurate or reliable information. Other times, doing an experiment where if I want to see the impact of some sort of drug or substance on somebody and their behavior or their intelligence, it can be unethical to force somebody to take a drug. So there's different types of designs that are going to be beneficial for different types of questions. And as we walk through this course, one of the things I always want you to keep in mind is how do I select the appropriate type of research method to meet my question in order to get the most accurate information and also to do it in an ethical manner. Let's go ahead and move on. So someone makes a claim. Can you trust it? Right? Somebody says, I don't think we ever landed on the moon. Well, okay. Where's the facts to support that? Or somebody else says that taking this particular substance or this little pill will make you healthier and increase your metabolism. Okay, what are the facts to back it up? And that's going to be one of the backbones that I really want to stress this semester is how do I trust a claim? And the key thing is research. We need to do research. We need to look at sources, look at other studies that have been out there, look at what the experts say about it. But never trust one simple claim until you've had a chance to look at multiple sources of information about it. So two of the key things that sort of start with this part that I want you to take away is one is the concept of skepticism. Now, skepticism doesn't mean that you just completely disbelieve anything somebody else says as being true, but rather, whenever somebody makes a claim to you, you start off with a little bit of doubt and you challenge those assertions. You ask, well, where did this information come from? Is it a reliable source? How do you know this? How many studies have been done on this particular topic? And you challenge that particular information to find out, does it seem to be something that has held up in the scientific literature? And looking at our next term here, has it been able to be replicated, right? If taking a little white pill is supposed to make your metabolism faster or supposed to make you feel happier, has that been shown to work over and over again? If somebody comes forth and claims that a certain type of law enforcement strategy is proven to reduce crime rates, well, has it worked? Has it worked in different places? Has it been tested throughout different studies or different locations or over different time periods? So skepticism and replication are going to be two key things to always keep in mind. If something's true, and it is a fact, it should be able to be replicated from one study to the next. And that's one of the things we want to do when we scrutinize research. Let's go ahead and move on. So one other thing we want to make sure of is the idea of what we call ethics. And just like we see All of you, when you read through the syllabus, we always have to have information about cheating and plagiarism. Yes, students cheat. It's not fun, but it happens. And people plagiarize, people steal other individuals' words and put it as if they are their own thoughts or words. Guess what? Just because a researcher has a master's degree or a JD or a PhD or some other fancy letters after that name, that doesn't always mean that they're going to be an ethical person. And we'll talk about some examples as we go through this course of people who are very well respected individuals, and in order for them to get published, because that's what we have to do to keep our jobs, they plagiarized other people's information. They were fraudulent about the data that they collected. They tweaked it just a little bit so they could get statistically significant findings. So the idea of skepticism, replication, and thinking of research as being an ethical duty are three really important things for us to consider. Let's move on to the next slide. All right, so the logic of criminal justice research. This is the second of the three major points that we want to cover in this lecture. And this goes back to sort of the philosophical origin of, well, how do we know? Like, how do I know something? Well, many of us, whether we realize it or not, we go through life with something known as experiential reality. That's how we learn to know. If I'm playing on the beach and I see a honeybee land on the sand or land on my towel, and I go, that's a cute little animal, and I pick it up and it stings me, I get the experience pretty quick, like, ow, that hurts, right? If I've ever played baseball and tried to field a ground ball and had it bounce up and hit me in the chest and then go, ow, that hurts, that's experiential reality. We know through life and we build stuff. And the cool thing about this is the fancy terminology for experiential reality is empirical methods. Empirical methods is saying that the way that we figure out facts and we start to understand the reality of the world around us is through experience and observation. The first time you try to ride a bike, you probably didn't do too well, but you realize over time, I need to pedal at a certain rate to get that bike going. I need to find balance. Once I learned that, I needed to know how to turn the bike effectively. And so through experience and empirical methods, we start to know. Now, when we look at how we conceptualize knowing something, there are sort of two philosophical viewpoints that we're going to see that will sort of provide the background of many of the research methods we're going to cover this semester or this course. The first is sort of the classic one based on empirical methods, and that is positivism. With positivism, the goal is trying to figure out universal truths, those singular facts that cannot be disputed. And the idea here, as you can see quoted under the positivism tab there, is that obtaining knowledge based on the assumption of some objective reality that can be discovered with observed data. So what does that mean? Well, positivism assumes that there is an objective reality. There is a universal truth. This is good. This is bad. If I do this, that will happen. Things of that nature. But the tough part is a lot of our scientific methods that are based upon positivism began with agricultural science or studying the physical world around us. You know, how do I get a plant to grow? What happens when I add this substance to water? Does it, things of that nature. For us, though, the tough part is a lot of our research, we're looking at humans, and humans are complex creatures. And this is where we see a second philosophical viewpoint that is just as effective in contributing to our understanding of human behavior, and that is phenomenology. And phenomenology, at the crux, as you can see there, is the idea that truth and reality are determined from your own point of view. Now, what the heck do I mean by that? Well, if I ask people to define beauty, not everyone's going to have the same concept of beauty. If I say, define what you think is a comfortable, happy place, some people are going to talk about going to Disneyland. Other people are going to talk about going to the beach. Other people are going to talk about sitting on their couch and binging Netflix shows, right? So with phenomenology, we realize that not everyone is the same. And maybe with human behavior, there isn't necessarily one truth. This is what beauty is. This is what makes a person happy. No, We are very dynamic, complex creatures. And so the research methods that utilize the notion of phenomenology understands that and understands that what is true to you comes from your own point of view. And also, a second part of phenomenology that makes it useful for research methods when it comes to studying humans is the fact that you understand that your concept of what's good and bad, what's healthy, what's unhealthy, what's beautiful, what's ugly, are shaped and reshaped through interactions with others over time. And this has a philosophical term called symbolic interactionism. So, two very quick examples of that. Right now, we are in the summer of 2020, where we're seeing changes in our political views. We're seeing changes with protest and Black Lives Matter. And I think a lot of people, and with the COVID-19 stuff in the background, a lot of people are going to come out of this summer and this year with a different view of the world. What's a healthy way to go about going to the supermarket? What is really an appropriate sort of symbol to represent our country? What is the reality of somebody who looks different from me, whether it be gender, skin color, height, age, whatever? So we learn and relearn, and that's one of the cool things about humans is we get a chance to have things shaped and reshaped. The tough side, though, and many of you may start to understand this or have seen this in some of your other courses, is one of the things about phenomenology is it understands also how somebody can become stigmatized or labeled as either a good person or a criminal or a drug addict. And maybe they don't necessarily start out that way. Even the worst criminals aren't that much different from the most pristine individuals. They've made a few mistakes, they've had repercussions, but once you get into the system, once people start to label you as a bad person, not only do you get labeled, but maybe when you look in the mirror, you say, well, if everyone else thinks I'm a bad person, maybe I really am. So with both of these things, one of the things that I will also reiterate throughout this course is both of these philosophical viewpoints, positivism, the search for what is truth, what is the fact, and phenomenology, this idea of changing truth and understanding reality from people's own points of view, need to coexist. And we use all types of research methods in order to understand them. Let's go ahead and move on. Two other things that kind of tie into the notion of the logic of research are, one, we have to understand that research coming out of any time period is situated within a particular paradigm. What the heck does a paradigm mean? Well, in a simplest sense, paradigms are a set of shared research assumptions and tools that shape our observations of reality. So if you've taken a theory class, our criminal justice theory course, you probably are somewhat familiar with the idea of how we had the Beccaria classical school of thought, where there was an assumption that humans were rational creatures, and the idea of committing crime was individuals weighing the cost and benefits of certain actions. That was a paradigm. There were certain assumptions about the human condition, that people were rational, that they wanted to benefit happiness and avoid pain. And that those shaped the tools and how we observed reality. Then you move forward to biological positivism, late 1800s, and we see people like Lombroso. And we see this idea of the belief that there were inferior people, people with atavistic qualities, throwbacks, and that was the true cause of crime. It wasn't rational choice. No, no, no. Rather, it was some people just weren't evolved enough to understand how to get along in the world. And the people who were committing crime were actually just people who were biologically inferior. And then that changed, and we get into the 1920s and the 1930s. We see the Chicago School, and we see the growth of sort of sociological views of crime. And we realize that maybe people get engaged in crime not because of a rational choice thing, maybe not because they're biologically or psychologically inferior, but rather it's society. It's the environment they grow up in. It is the constraints and the strains on their lives. So, and we've seen this, and right now, once again, 2020 is a perfect time. We are in a paradigm shift of how we are starting to understand human behavior, the public's interaction with law enforcement, race relations, how we handle infectious diseases. This is a fascinating time for thinking about research, but also we need to understand whenever we look back at older research, think about the paradigm. What was the main dominant thought process that was going through a lot of these people's minds during that time period? And hopefully it'll make us respect, understand that research, but also understand its shortcomings and realize how things are changing. Finally, on this slide, we see this concept that research hypotheses should be falsifiable. Okay, that sounds pretty straightforward. What does falsifiable mean? It means that a hypothesis should be able to be proven false. So if I make a hypothesis that, or a claim that all rattlesnakes have rattles, well, all you got to do is if you find one rattlesnake that doesn't have a rattle at the end of its tail, or the end of its body, I guess, you have proven that claim false. So as we go through and think about research hypotheses, whether it's us reviewing other people's research or whether it's you conducting your own research in this course, always remember it has to be written in a way that it can be proven false. That's the only way that you're going to have a good hypothesis, because the more it gets supported, the stronger it becomes. And we'll come in back to that in a little bit more later in this semester. So let's go ahead and move on. All right, so how do we think about the strategy of criminal justice research? So this is the third and final component of this first lecture, is what goes into it? How do we sort of break it down? Well, one of the things that I like to always conceptualize as is what is known as the learning loop. We start with induction, theory formation. In its simplest sense, induction means we go out and we observe the world. We collect a lot of observations. We watch the sun come up, we watch the flowers bloom, we watch the sun go down, we see the flowers go, sort of like close up for the night. We see the seasons change, we see how people behave. We collect information. That's the beginning part of induction. After you've collected quite a bit of information, you start to formulate general principles. And general principles are going to be the concept behind theory formation. So induction is formulating general principles from the accumulation of observations. So if I go out and I want to plant a garden, right now went through spring into summer, a lot of us with staying at home, and we're going, I want to grow tomatoes in my yard. Well, I throw out a bunch of seeds and I observe what happens to those seeds. Some of them don't even sprout. Some of them do sprout. Some of them, once they sprout, wither and die. Others turn into a beautiful plant that produces beautiful fruit. And I'm going, how did that happen? That's kind of induction. You observe a bunch of things and you start to realize after a while, aha, in order to grow a plant, I need to have some basic general principles. I need to have decent soil. I need to have the appropriate amount of water, the appropriate amount of sunlight. And once I get all those things combined, I have a theory. And that theory is if I add X, Y, and Z together, I can grow the perfect tomato. So where do we go from research after that? Then we go to deduction. Now, deduction is I take that general principle. I need water, soil, light to grow my tomatoes. And I create a hypothesis. And my hypothesis is if I have this amount of soil, this amount of light, this amount of water, I bet I can grow another perfect tomato plant. So that's the idea of deduction. I apply it to that specific setting. Then I move on to testing that particular hypothesis. And in hypothesis testing, this is when we're actually getting our hands dirty, pun intended about dirt and soil and everything. But hypothesis testing is when we get out there and we actually test what we thought might happen. So I write down my hypothesis that if I have X amount of water, X amount of soil, X amount of daily light, this seed will turn into a beautiful tomato plant. I test it, and in the final step, I get feedback. Maybe it worked, and I replicated it, right? We saw that on an earlier slide. That feedback could be a positive finding. Then I go, yes, this hypothesis seems to be supported. Or we also talked about hypotheses needing to be falsifiable. If the feedback comes back where it fails miserably, and maybe my seed doesn't even sprout or my plant dies early on, that's a different type of feedback. And remember, any feedback in the realm of research is good because we want to see things replicated over and over again if we really want to trust it. And this isn't just about farming. Once again, going back to humans, if you think about like what's the best way to educate a child to get them to become a strong reader, there's research looking at that. What's the best way to empower a group of individuals and make sure that they get good jobs and stay crime free? There's research about that. So this idea of this sort of four-step process of induction, then deduction, then hypothesis testing, then feedback creates this loop. And if you read a research article, in fact, in our next lecture, I got a couple articles that I posted for you guys on Beachboard that I'm going to encourage you to look at the methods section. But if you look at an overall research article, you'll notice it kind of follows this. The first part is sort of the introduction and literature review. That's pretty much them telling you the induction stuff, saying here's what other people have found, and so from all these observations and studies, here's the theory that is out there. Then they move to the back end of that introduction section or literature review, and they give you their hypotheses. That's step 2, the deduction. Then they move into the methods and the results. The methods, how did we do this study? The results, what kind of statistics did we run? That's the hypothesis testing. And then finally, a good research article finishes with that discussion/conclusion section. That's where we get the feedback. And we say, okay, what did we find in this study and how can this help further future research or better inform us? And as you can see, that's why I always tell students when they're looking for getting into research, I say sometimes one of the best places to read in an article is that back end, that discussion conclusion section, because it'll give you ideas of what questions still need to be answered in a stronger way, or what have we not figured out yet. And then you can go, yes, I'm going to be the one to go out and try to answer that question and contribute to this area of knowledge. So we want to contribute to knowledge. We want to understand the world, whether we're looking for a positivistic approach where we're trying to figure out what are the universal truths in the world, or a phenomenological approach, which says in this point, in this time period, or in this person's mind, how do they see it? We need to establish causal connections. So what do I mean by establishing causal connections? Well, if I have some sort of hypothesis that I say, I believe that using illicit drugs, marijuana, cocaine, methamphetamine, whatever, while you're in high school will have a negative impact on your academic ability. So that's my thing. Using drugs leads to poor academic performance. I may make that claim, once again, going back to the idea of a claim. How do I back it up? How do I support it? Well, I need to conduct some research. So in order to say using drugs will have a negative impact on your academic performance, I have to establish that causal connection. And there's 3 things we need to do. The first step is I need to establish that there is in fact an association between drug use and academic performance. This is the easiest part. This is what I can do using statistics, even a pretty rudimentary research design. I can establish association. What do I mean by association? Well, association means that 2 things move together in a predictable fashion. So we either have a positive association, whereas one thing goes up, so does the other thing. And then we can also have a negative association, whereas one thing goes up, the other thing drops. So with my example of drug use and academic performance, that would be an example of a negative association. And I'm hypothesizing that the more you use drugs, as drug use goes up, academic performance declines. So drug use goes up, academic performance goes down. People who don't use drugs seem to do really well in school. People who use a lot of drugs do poorly in school, and people who sort of dabble with a drug here and there do average. So that's this idea of association or covariation. That's easy to establish. And in a statistics course, you can figure out, and you'll talk about measures of association like the Pearson R or the Pearson correlation coefficient. That does a very good job of doing that. But that's not causality. That is merely association. And this is where we got to be careful as skeptical consumers of research not to buy into simply because you see an association that establishes causation, because that gets us into a lot of trouble. So what else do we need to establish a causal connection? Well, step two, I got to make sure what came first. And the fancy term here is temporal precedence. In other words, say that the cause comes before the effect. Well, what's the cause? What's the effect? Well, in a research study, usually you have a cause, otherwise known as an independent variable, influencing an effect, the dependent variable. So you have an independent variable that should influence the dependent variable. You have a cause that should influence an effect. In the example that I was talking about, drug use is my independent variable or my cause. Academic performance is my dependent variable or my effect. So I'm saying that drug use leads to poor academic performance. Well, why is this idea of temporal precedence important? Think about this. If I put out a survey and I ask a bunch of high school students, say in their junior year of high school, and I say, how often do you use this particular type of drug, that particular type of drug, etc.? And I also ask them, what is your current GPA? What kind of grades are you getting? Things that nature. I can see whether or not there's an association between grade point average and drug use using some basic statistics based upon their responses to those questions. But I don't know which came first. Is it that they were using drugs and then started doing poorly in school, or it could be completely the opposite? Maybe they did poorly in school all the way up through middle school and early in high school, and they're going, school sucks. I got to find a way to entertain myself, so I'm going to go to school high. And so maybe it was reversed. Maybe that their poor school performance said, I need to find a way to get through the day, and so I'm going to zone out of school and I'm going to find something to calm my brain with drugs. Right? We need to establish that. Or maybe they both sort of came together at the same time because of some outside factors, and we'll come back to that in a second. So a good research study also is able to establish temporal precedence. And we'll talk about going forward the difference between cross-sectional studies where all your data is collected at one time versus longitudinal research where you collect data sort of in waves or stages. And we'll see that longitudinally set up designs are much better at establishing temporal precedence than what are known as cross-sectional studies. So keep that in mind going forward. Now, the final thing that we need for this is ruling out rival hypotheses. What do I mean by this? Well, let's go back to my initial example. I made the claim to begin with saying that using drugs will lead to poor academic performance. So A was using drugs. That was my cause. B was poor academic performance. That was my effect. It's possible that there's some other thing that may have an influence on one or both of those things. So imagine this. I say drug use leads to or influences your academic performance. Well, there's other things in your life that could have an influence on whether or not you use drugs and also have an influence on how well you do in school, correct? Maybe it's your home life. If your home life really sucks, mom and dad are fighting there all the time, or they're yelling at you, or it's an abusive environment, maybe that will have an influence on your ability to study and do homework and do well in school. And it may also have an influence on whether or not you're looking for an escape and you turn to drugs for that, right? It could be who you hang out with. Do you have a group of friends that value a strong education and value the idea of health and abstaining from illicit substances? Or do you have a peer group that values using drugs and says, screw school, I don't care about it, right? These are the example of what I call rival hypotheses, or a term that we will see going forward are known as confounding factors or spuriousness. These are some of the terms that you'll see that go with this number 3. Confounding factors and spuriousness. Some third thing or outside thing that is actually influencing your two main things, your cause and your effect. And it's only when we can establish all three of these things that we truly can say we have established a causal connection. Now, number 1, association, is pretty darn easy to do statistically and using methods. And so people tend to lean on that heavily. Number two, temporal precedence. If you have the right type of research design, you can do a pretty good job with that one. Number three is always the hard one. Ruling out rival hypotheses is the thorn in our side when it comes to research. And we'll talk about different types of designs and their ability to establish that third one. And you'll see, just as a hint, that good old-fashioned classic controlled true experiment is probably our best one for ruling out those rival hypotheses. Survey research, qualitative observational research, not so strong at ruling out rival hypotheses. So we always have to understand the limitations of various studies we're going to do.